Hi everyone, welcome back to this tutorial on how to bind data to the Blazor HeatMap Chart component. In this video, I will show you how to bind two-dimensional array data and JSON data to the Blazor HeatMap Chart component using the cell binding and row binding methods. I will open an existing Blazor application where I have placed the HeatMap component bound to an array of data using the row binding method. In the row binding method, each object in the array renders as a column in the HeatMap Chart component. To see how to get started with the HeatMap Chart and bind the array data using the row binding method, refer to the video linked in the card above. I will run this application to show the initial output. Look at the HeatMap Chart component rendered with the defined data source. You can see that each object in the array renders as a column here. But in the cell binding method, you can define the position of the data points by defining the x-axis and y-axis values. Let's see how to bind the array data using the cell binding method. Within the getHeatMapData method, I modify the existing data source with two-dimensional array objects. Here, each object in the array represents the x-axis, y-axis, and the appropriate data point. For example, here 0 represents the position of the x-axis, 1 represents the position of the y-axis, and 14.5 represents the appropriate data point value. Similarly, each object represents each data point in the HeatMap chart. I modify the string array y labels based on the data source values. These arrays store the collection of axis labels and display a label on the axis when mapped to the labels property of the HeatMap x-axis and HeatMap y-axis. To configure the HeatMap chart with the two-dimensional array objects, I need to use the data adapter. So, I define the HeatMap data source settings tag and define the adapter type property with the value cell. As you know, I have bound the two-dimensional array object data source. So, I set the isJSON data property to false. See, the HeatMap chart is rendered using the cell binding method. Here, the data point 14.5 corresponds to the cell in row 0 and column 1, which represents the x-axis value of 0 and y-axis value of 1. Next, I will show how to bind JSON data to the HeatMap chart using the cell binding method. Let me comment out the existing data source and create a new JSON data source. I create a model class, HeatMapData, and add the properties row ID, column ID, and value with the appropriate data type. After that, I create an array of type HeatMapData called JSON data. And assign values to row ID, column ID, and value fields. Here, each object represents each cell in the HeatMap chart. Row ID represents the position of x-axis, column ID represents the position of y-axis, and value represents the appropriate data point value. I modify the data source property and assign JSON data to it. I also set the isJSON data to true. Now, I need to map the data source fields, row ID, column ID, and value to the HeatMap chart component. So, I define the xData mapping property and map the row ID field to it. Similarly, I map the column ID field to the yData mapping property and the value field to the value mapping property. Look here, the HeatMap chart is rendered with the defined JSON cell data. In this example, let's look at this data point 77.6, which is plotted on the HeatMap chart with the x-axis value, France, and y-axis value, 2010. Finally, I will show you how to bind JSON data to the HeatMap chart component using the row binding method. To demonstrate, I comment out the existing fields in this model class and add the fields region, January 2000, January 2004, and so on. After that, I modify the existing data source by adding appropriate values to the newly defined data fields. Then, I modify the string array's X labels and Y labels based on the data source. Then, change the adapter type to table and map the field region to the X-axis by setting it to the X data mapping property. The other fields will be automatically mapped to the Y-axis and data point values, respectively. Check now, the heat map chart component is rendered with the JSON data using the row binding method. Notice here, the data point 93 lies on the heat map chart where the X-axis represents the region, USA, and Y-axis, the month January 2000. In this video, you have seen how to bind an array and JSON data to the heat map chart component, using the cell binding and row binding methods. If you would like to see a working example, you can download it from the GitHub link in the description below. I have also provided a link where you can see if you qualify for a free license key to use our Blazor products through our community license. If you found this video useful, do like the video and subscribe to our channel. Thanks for watching.